Hello and welcome to the Clean Bill of Wealth podcast for Canadian doctors. I am your host, Galen Nuttall. Join me as I interview doctors and related professionals and talk about what it takes to achieve wealth in this, the Great White North. Not just wealth as measured by a bank account, but also family, faith, and health. Be sure to go to GalenHelpsDocs.com. That is Galen, that is how my name is spelled, helpsdocs.com, to get access to my free video series where I uncover the top myths about growing your wealth as a doctor, north of the wall. Now, please enjoy the show. So here I am with Lisa McMurder at the Hospice Quinte office in Belleville, Ontario. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Perfect. And so we met a little bit ago at an event, and I realized at that event that I do not know a lot about hospice, period, and less about what Hospice Quinte is up to. So I thought it'd be really cool to talk to you, to learn more about what hospice is, and also what Hospice Quinte in particular is up to, because I figured if I don't know, a lot of other people don't either.
Yeah, so you're definitely not alone there. So I guess long story short, basically what Hospice Quinte does is we provide support and reprieve for caregivers, and we provide comfort and companionship to individuals who are palliative at their end of life. We also provide bereavement support to individuals in the community that have experienced the loss of a loved one. And we also provide bereavement support to the family members of the palliative clients that we serve. So our service doesn't actually end with the family member after they pass. We try and maintain a relationship with that family to extend our bereavement services to them afterwards as well.
Okay, and so who or what would happen in someone's life for them to say, oh, I should call hospice? Like, what were the top, three people that should be calling you, or three things that happen in someone's life and they say, oh, I should get in touch with hospice?
So typically people who are using our services have to be diagnosed with a terminal illness.
Okay.
And there's a certain scale, I don't recall exactly what it's called, but there's a certain scale that Jan McInnes uses. Jan is the lovely woman who works with us that goes out and does the client assessments. Mm-hmm. So if you were diagnosed with a terminal illness, let's say, for example, lung cancer, mm-hmm. And you were in a position in this illness where, you were starting to need more hands-on care, more around-the-clock care, mm-hmm. That would be a great time to call hospice. Okay. So essentially what Hospice Quinte is going to do is we're sort of going to fill that gap between the family caregiver and the professional caregivers, like the professional medical care that you would get that's covered through the Ontario Health Care Act.
Got it. Okay. So someone who, could a family member who, someone gets diagnosed, could one of their family members call, or they have to be the one, or how does that work?
So that's actually one of the misconceptions that people have about hospice is that mm-hmm. you need a doctor's referral. Oh. So anybody can actually refer for our services. So if you are the one who's been diagnosed with the illness, you can self-refer. If you are the primary caregiver, you can make the referral on behalf of the individual you're caring for. But the one sort of caveat of referrals for hospice is the person who would be receiving the hospice care has to agree to it. Right. And there are a lot of times, though, when the family is prepared for hospice, but the person who is actually terminally ill is not. Yeah. And that's where families can kind of run into a little bit of a bump in the road.
Sure. And I guess so the biggest misconception I had around hospice was before we met a month ago or whenever it was, someone asked me, what does hospice do? I would have said, and this is literally what I would have said, I would have said, well, I think they've got some beds, and I think that you go there when you have terminal illness, yep. and you don't have a lot of time left. That's what I would have said, mm-hmm. and I was completely wrong. I guess.
Well, not completely. Okay. You're close. And then I guess the misconception that you had about the beds. So that's something that's a huge misconception that we're being faced with in the community. So right now we're actually in the process of building a hospice care center. We don't have any community-based hospice beds in Quinte, so in our region. Mm-hmm. Really, the only access we have to palliative care is through the hospitals, and that's very limited. We had an office on Dundas Street over by BioNiche, mm-hmm. And that's why a lot of people were under.
House, yeah.
It was a house, and that's why a lot of people were under mm-hmm. the impression that we had beds. Mm-hmm. We haven't had beds since the 80s.
Okay.
So back in the 80s, we had one bed, and it was fully funded by our organization, by Hospice Quinte, and it was called Hospice House. I believe it was only open for about 3 years, and then the board had to vote to close Hospice House because our organization was funding it solely. There was no government support for the bed, so we were basically running the organization and the hospice bed simultaneously, and it just wasn't feasible. So we closed that bed.
Mm-hmm. And so before I talk a little bit more about what hospice does, you personally, like, what is it that attracted you to work with hospice, or what have you seen that hospice is able to provide that makes you so passionate about it?
So I'm a big believer that everything happens for a reason. I'm going to say probably back in 2011 or 12, I lost my grandfather to COPD. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that disease, but it is a terminal illness.
Okay.
And it's a very ugly, nasty one that can make people very weak, and it affects your lungs. So breathing can be a real big challenge. Moving around can be a challenge. So my grandfather, his illness progressed to the point where he was bedridden, and he was being cared for at home by my grandmother. I'm not sure my family was even aware of hospice at that point in time. I wasn't personally, but I personally got to experience the loss of my grandfather at home, and I saw the difficulties that they experienced with that. There were a lot of costs involved with, getting a hospital bed to fit in a senior's apartment building. That's quite expensive and not really realistic when you're a senior, especially where my grandparents were living and the health that they're in, and they spent a lot on just things that he didn't even really end up using because he was bedridden. So there was a lot of costs involved, and and to see him sort of just lay there on the couch and have my grandmother care for him until his death, it was a lot to take in. And then this past July, I lost my father to COPD, and when he was actually in Belleville Hospital, I saw the job posting for Hospice Quinte. And it was one of those calls that you got where it was kind of like, we're not quite sure how he's going to do. We don't know if he's going to make it, so make sure you come out and you see him, you say your goodbyes, kind of thing, just in case. So I had done just that, and then after my visit with my dad, I saw the posting on Facebook, and I read what hospice was doing, and I was living it. I lived it to a certain degree, and it was something I could really stand behind. So I applied for the job, and I got the call from Jennifer, and they offered me the position, and that's how I wound up here. So for me, it means a lot that I'm able to make the community richer instead of just a corporation or a family. And for me, I know that I'm never going to be, a famous celebrity or someone that's going to go down in history. But for me, when I die and when my time comes, there's going to be a hospice built in this community that I was a part of, a part of the process in making that happen. And I think, at least for me, that's something that I can be very proud of. So.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a fascinating way that you got involved. And before we hit record, you were talking about how you oftentimes speak to groups of seniors.
Yes.
And you're like, hey, I'm really passionate about talking about palliative care. And
that's
they wonder why someone so young has any sort of link to it. And so, one thing I was going to ask was, if it's okay to ask this, is in the case of your grandfather, for example, where, and this happens a lot, I've seen it, where it's a couple, and it's really, one of the things I've learned more and more about is the shifting demographics over the last century, basically. I read recently that the average person in the early 1900s only lived 2 years in retirement. Like, they retired and they lived a few more years and they died. And they died quickly. Like, more on average, they died much more quickly than people can now, because we have so much life-saving technology that sometimes extends life but doesn't always continue the quality of life.
Right.
And so that's pretty common to see a couple, in their 80s and 90s, and all of a sudden one has to take care of the other, or even more than before, or all over. And usually, like, I've certainly seen it with my with my wife's grandparents of one knew how to drive, one didn't know how to drive, one knew how to use all the banking stuff, the other one didn't know how to use all the banking stuff. And so when one of them goes, it's a huge thing because there's this whole half of their life that they don't even know how to take care of. And so in the case, of your grandfather, you painted a pretty vivid picture there, like, and you said you didn't know about hospice.
No, me personally, I didn't.
Yeah. So in what ways could hospice have helped in that moment?
That's a wonderful question. So the best way I like to describe that to people is in that specific situation, hospice would have allowed my grandmother to be my grandfather's wife again, instead of his caregiver. It would have allowed us all a little bit more peace of mind that she had that extra support, that he was being, his comfort was something that was being looked after on a consistent basis. If my grandmother needed to leave to do something, there was someone with him, a companion, and somebody who was trained to know how to work with an individual who is at their end of life. Like, these individuals are frail. They're not eating a lot. Really, they're there just for comfort, companionship, and reprieve for the caregiver.
That's really powerful to say, allow your grandmother to be his wife again, because I imagine because she took on this role of caregiver, and that's got to be...
Well, and I find too, there's been a lot of research going on with caregivers, and they're finding that sort of the average age of the caregiver is lower. It's not always a senior, so it's like people who are in their 30s to 40s, and and that's unfortunate because some of these individuals have families of their own. So, let's say you were a 35, 45-year-old man or woman, and you have a family of your own, and one of your parents becomes terminal. It takes on average 54 hours a week to care for a dying loved one at home, and that's on top of your 40 hours a week at work. That's on top of any time that you need to take care of your kids or, take them to their activities, hockey, ballet, whatever. That's on top of caring for yourself, on top of groceries, housework. So that's, it's a really powerful thing to have the assistance of a hospice volunteer. And one of the biggest issues that we have are late referrals. So in some cases, our volunteers will be matched up with a client, and they'll only make 1 or 2 visits before the client passes away. And it's because a lot of people really have no idea when's the right time to call. And we really encourage individuals that if they feel like this is something that they can benefit from, to call us. And Jan or Paul will come out and they'll do an assessment. And if you meet the criteria, then we can get the process started to get you paired up with a volunteer and get the visits happening. Another misconception is a lot of people think that hospice is sort of saved for an individual's final days of life, but that's not the case at all. So let's say you were given 12 months of life to live. We can be helping you from that point if you meet the criteria. I think it's called the PPI criteria. I could be mistaken, but
okay. So that's that's another thing I would have said. I would have said, hospice is for people who literally have like a couple weeks to go. That's my conception of sort of
and
hospice.
Hospice can be provided wherever the individual calls home too. So it doesn't have to just be in a hospital or a hospice care center. A lot of the time it is in the individual's own home. But we provide our visits to individuals in long-term care facilities, retirement residences. We work both with Belleville General and Trenton Memorial. And in some unique cases, we've had some clients that were homeless, and they were put up in sort of like a motel accommodation by another organization, like let's say Salvation Army, for example. And we would make visits to that individual in the motel.
Got it.
So wherever they call home, that's where we make the visit.
Okay. And then does hospice cost money?
No, and that's the other fabulous thing about our services. So all of our services are provided to the individuals and their family at absolutely no cost, and that's everything from the visiting service. Once we have the center open, the center is really going to elevate our capacity to provide quality hospice palliative care. The center is going to be a secured 24/7 facility where care is going to be provided. We like to say by an interdisciplinary team of of healthcare professionals. So that sort of ranges from our volunteers, so our hospice volunteers will still have a role there. It'll be PSWs, and then we'll have some nursing staff as well. And these folks will be there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to care for the residents that are in there. And that service will also be provided at no cost.
And so in that case, I mean, I almost was going to pause and ask you if I should even ask, because I was like, should I even ask you if it costs anything?
No.
Because that's the other thing I'm sitting here wondering, like, okay, how does this work?
Yes, you're probably thinking, geez, this is going to cost someone $1 million.
Yeah, or you have to have like insurance or something like that.
No, and the other sort of interesting information on that is currently we're only funded 25% through the Ministry of Health, so through the LIN, and 75% we have to make up from donations and fundraising.
Oh, wow.
But when we get into the new center, the Ministry of Health has been doing some big investing in hospice.
Okay.
So when our application was approved to build ours, they decided that they were going to give us $105,000 per year per bed in terms of operating costs.
Okay.
So that's really what's going to allow us to successfully operate this hospice, because we are getting some government funding. And the beauty in that also is we're required to build our hospice to their new government standard. So our hospice is going to be sort of like world-class, first of its kind in our region. It's essentially going to be a miniature hospital, but when you're inside of it, it's going to look and feel as much like a home as possible. So it's going to be really amazing. And with that funding, so they're going to give us annual funding per bed, and they've also given us $1.2 million in capital to build the center. So we're getting a lot of support from the government to operate this. But once we get into the new center, our fundraising plans will have to adjust to make up the difference in that gap, because we're very small right now, and we're going to a pretty large operation.
Right. Well, I can only imagine that the need continues to grow just because of, again, the aging demographic. I mean,
and ironically, in Quinte, we have a higher than provincial average of seniors in our region. Yes. So with the aging population, this is just something that's even more significant for our region to look at.
Well, I think another thing I find fascinating, I mean, I have a client, she passed away, but she passed away at about, I think, 94 a couple years ago. And she was really funny, but every time I met with her, she'd say, I didn't plan on living this long. She's like, when there were outliers. Like my great grandparents lived into their 90s, but they were outliers. Like, a lot of people say, oh, no, I remember so-and-so lived to be really old, but it's like, no, the average person did not live that long. And a lot of the diseases that we have treatment for now would have been, people would not have survived, heart attack, stroke, and cancer to the extent that they do now.
That's right.
And so it's great. There's been these advances in technology. People are living longer. I mean, it's all pretty good news. But then again, like there is this huge, one course I took called it the silver wave, like this wave of people, like this big demographic bubble. And like you were saying, so there's the 70 plus, but then there's also the kids. And I did an interview recently where the term sandwich generation was used, where it's adults who have aging parents and still are kind of taking care of their kids to some capacity, and at oftentimes kind of the peak of their career while they're in their 40s and 50s, like really rolling with the career. They got the kids, and then they also have the parents, and that can be super exhausting.
They're most affected by the whole caregiving role. That's what we're finding is the sandwich generation. They're the ones who are really sort of taking the brunt of it. And then they are starting to see some younger individuals coming into it, especially in their 30s. I was reading an article the other day about that, about how there's a lot more younger people that are taking on the caregiving role, and they're wondering, is it actually preventing younger people from living their lives? So like me myself, I don't have children yet, and if my mother wound up palliative, she's my world, and I would take care of her, and it would prevent me from pursuing my own life and my own dream, because I'm taking care of my mother. So I just thought that was a really interesting article, because it resonated with me, because I was sort of in that situation, right? I fit the group, and I wasn't the primary caregiver for my father, but when he was near his end of life, I was doing a lot of running around and errands for him, and it became like it was a lot to deal with. And when I would spend time with him, because of his COPD, it was hard for him to talk. So then that made it sort of extra difficult, because it's like as you were spending time with him, you were sort of grieving him being gone, because you're witnessing it, right? So, and another interesting thing that I did want to mention to you about hospice is a lot of people don't really think about planning for end of life.
No.
You know, we really do think about, you know, our healthcare and investing in the hospital, and there is so much value in doing that because, you know, it's there when we need it. But very few people actually think about what's going to happen at end of life. And only 3% of Canadians actually die suddenly. So that means 97% of us know we're going to die. And death is usually a long, drawn-out process that requires a lot of care, comfort care.
Yeah. And so I want to talk about that a little bit and then make sure that we circle back a little bit to what Hospice Quinte is doing specifically. But so I heard a statistic that over 90% of powers of attorney are enacted because, I gave a talk recently about the value of having a will. Only 50% of people in Ontario have a will. I don't know what percentage of them also have a power of attorney, which is, if something happens, I'm still alive, but I can't make decisions for myself. Who will make those decisions? I can only assume it's less than 50 because I don't think everyone who gets a will gets a power of attorney. But I heard something like 90-something% of them are used at some point, which makes sense. If someone's dying slowly and then they're no longer to make decisions for themselves, someone else has to come in and make those decisions.
That's right.
And when I heard that statistic, it really did blow my mind. And I think 3%, only 3% dying suddenly.
It's crazy.
Yeah, that is crazy. Like I don't even know what I thought.
Well, a lot of us, even in the advances our culture and our society has had around death, like we do talk about it a little bit more. It's not as taboo, as it used to be. It is a part of life. But our image of death is very much of sort of the final instant that it happens.
Yeah.
And that really only happens like for 3% of us. So
very small number.
That's where advanced care planning comes in huge. And we're big advocates of advanced care planning. On our website, if you visit hospicequinte.ca, we have an information and resources section where you can find lots of great information. There's an organization called Speak Up, and they're huge advocates of advanced care planning. And essentially, they have information on everything from how to start having a conversation about planning someone's end of life. It could be something as simple as, hey, Mom, I was thinking the other day that if anything serious ever happened to you and your health, I wouldn't know what you'd want to do. I wouldn't know what kind of care you'd want, what kind of care you wouldn't want. So I'd, really like to take some time to talk to you about that. And I mean, it's a difficult conversation to have that no one wants to have, but how much better will you feel at the end of the day knowing that you've honored your loved one's wishes in terms of how they want their end of life, or even just their healthcare decisions to be handled, right? I mean, if you were ever incapacitated and you weren't able to speak for yourself and you wanted to die in a hospice, but you couldn't vocalize it, well, unfortunately, I think at that point, there's not a lot that can happen because you have not yet communicated, right? You haven't communicated what it is you want to do. And I mean, depending on what you have set up with your power of attorney and whatnot, it leaves a big question mark for a lot of people, right?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I mean, it's kind of funny because I forget, a part of my job is to ask people to think about what's going to happen at the end of their life from all sorts of perspectives of who would be impacted financially and what's going to happen from a tax perspective. I ask people that question, and when I started as an advisor, I really didn't like asking that question, because basically I asked people
hard questions to ask.
If you had passed away yesterday, who would be affected today? To what extent, financially and otherwise. And I hated asking the question, but what I realized was not a lot of people were out there asking it. And it's a great question because not many people think about it. And so, I really encourage people, because every time I give a talk about estate planning, people come up to me afterwards and they tell me the horror stories of something that they went through because they didn't have a will or they didn't have things in place. And one of the big things that I encourage people to do is, yes, will, yes, power of attorney, but a lot of times people don't have that conversation beforehand of why they want what they want. Because a lot of times I certainly just would assume, I'm pretty sure that this is what my parents want to have happen. And I mean, if they were to pass away and something different they were to say something different, I'd want to know why.
Exactly.
Probably. Like certain things, like, you know, I don't know, like, I'm giving money to this charity. I'd want to know why. Or like, you know, and I had someone one time, I gave a talk, and they said and I mean, also a big fan of pre-planning, or at least having a document that tells people what people want for their funeral.
Yeah.
I never used to think about that until I became an advisor, and I gave a talk, and someone said, you know, my mom passed away, I was grieving, you know, and I had to, it's kind of a whirlwind of getting things figured out around funerals and all sorts of, like, those first 5 to 10 days are just crazy, or 1 to 10 days. And she said my mom was a big fan of different types of music, and I didn't know what kind of music she wanted to play at her funeral. And that may seem like a small thing, but when that person is no longer around to ask, it's tough, you know, like to say, what did you want? And if there's any sort of a surprise in the will, they can't say why they did what they did. So just like you said, as difficult as the conversation is to have, you know, the first time you have it, it's going to be difficult. Maybe it's going to be a little bit longer. But once you've had that conversation, you only have to talk about it again if anything changes.
Well, and it gets easier to talk about it, and then you have that peace of mind. And like another thing that I don't think a lot of people really think about either is, like, now that we have MAID in effect in Canada, so medically assisted death. So, I mean, again, if that's something that you want to be open to have that option at your end of life, that's something that needs to be decided before you become incapacitated. Because if you are incapacitated and you can't speak for yourself, and you wish to, you know, to go down the path of medical assisted suicide, no one can do that for you unless you identify that yourself ahead of time. They won't allow it. So again, it's something that you have to consider, you know, and options are important, I think. And I think, you know, honoring our wishes of our loved ones is really important too. And like you said, when you're grieving, the last thing you want to do is to be making these important, difficult decisions. Like, you want to just, you know, you want to just process what's happening.
Yeah, and so what I want to do is wrap it up a little bit with what Hospice Quinny is doing.
Yeah.
So you're working on building and opening a new center. What's going on? What are the important things we should know about between now and then of what Hospice is up to?
So I guess the most important things to know are, I guess, where it's located. So we are building a 6-bed community-based hospice care center in Bayside, right across from Bayside Secondary. So the land was donated very generously by the City of Quinny West. They also donated $1 million in capital, as did the City of Belleville. And Tyendinaga Township, which is one of the other municipalities we serve, they have donated $75,000. So we've got a lot of support from the communities. It's going to be 6 beds, as I said. Some pretty cool features of our hospice that are unique. Every bedroom will have a private patio. So when you are spending time with your loved ones outside, it's not always in the public eye. So we have built on a private patio area in which the hospital beds can be wheeled out onto, so you can spend some time out in the fresh air and get some sunshine together. Every resident room will have an overnight accommodation, so you can spend the night with your loved one. We also created 3 sunrooms. So essentially a sunroom is like a big living room. And when we were doing some tours of hospices, they had sort of just like a large open concept community living room in most of them, and it wasn't being used. So we asked why. And between the the individuals that were using the hospice and the individuals working there, they basically said nobody wants to use it because everybody can see what's happening. So we created 3 private sunrooms that can be closed off, and they're large enough where you can have sort of a family gathering. You could do a birthday party if you wanted to celebrate Christmas, an anniversary. And then the other thing that we really wanted to take into consideration is when we hang out with our family, unless you're 12, you're not doing it in your bedroom. So it gives people another space outside of the individual's room to do that. We also have family laundry on site. We have a kitchen and dining room for the family to use, family washrooms so they can shower and take care of themselves. Basically, everything that you would have in a home, we're going to have in the hospice.
Yeah, that sounds like.
But it'll be built like a miniature hospital. It's going to be it's going to be unreal, I think. I'm pretty excited for it.
Yeah, it sounds really revolutionary. I mean, and even the things you're saying, I haven't thought of, like as my, I always think of visiting, my grandmother when she was sick a couple times. It was always that, got to go into the hospital, got to sign in, got to go up the elevator, got to hang out in a room
That's it.
where there's kind of nothing to do. They're just kind of laying in bed, and I mean, so I had appendicitis a couple last year, and a very minor thing compared to obviously anything that someone in hospice has to deal with. Mm-hmm. But even then, like I remember just kind of laying there and people like looking at me, and there was kind of nothing to look at. Like I was only in the hospital for a day.
Very clinical feeling environment.
Yeah, and it's just an odd situation to be in, and so certainly I can see how if someone is in that situation for a lengthy time, it'd be nice to like, okay, let's get outside so we're not just all staring at me, or get to this bigger room where it's not like my bed and like a bedside table. So I think that's really fantastic.
And then another feature that's really unique is we have one of the sunrooms and one of the residence suites that will be equipped with a special HVAC system, so our Indigenous neighbors can perform smudging ceremonies within the hospice. And then, that way we're really taking into consideration everyone's traditions and beliefs. Because again, that's something that's super important to hospice, is there's no discrimination. Who your family is who your family is, and we really do respect individuals' decisions and their cultures and all of those things.
That's amazing. Well, it sounds like you've thought of a lot and certainly familiar with what people are going through and what you can do to make it more manageable. And that's amazing. So to finish it off, you did mention this. You mentioned the website.
Yep.
But just what are the big links that people can go to, or the big pages that people can go to know more about hospice?
So you can find some really great information and resources, podcasts, and you can sign up for our monthly newsletter on our website at hospicequinte.ca. And we always have some amazing information about hospice palliative care, caregiver information, and grief and bereavement support information on our Facebook page or on Twitter.
Got it. Perfect. Well, thanks so much for joining me today, Lisa. I learned a ton, and it's very important information, so I'm happy to help.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity, Galen. We appreciate any opportunity we have to share this information with the public.
For sure. Thank you so much.
This is your host, Galen Nuttall. Thank you for joining me at A Clean Bill of Wealth, the podcast for Canadian doctors. I hope you enjoyed the show. Be sure to check out my free video series at galenhelpsdocs.com, where I debunk some of the myths around wealth generation for Canadian doctors. Take care and talk to you soon.